They said the storm would pass by dusk, but when Jed Rourke stepped off his horse, dust clung to every fold of his coat, like the past he never talked about. He squinted through the swirling haze outside the little trade post at the edge of Bitter Creek and saw something strange: 3 men arguing beside a wagon, and between them, a small figure standing still as a fence post, sack over his head, hands tied like livestock. That ain't something a man forgets. Not in one life. Jed wasn't looking for trouble. He'd ridden 20 miles through headwind and blowing grit just to buy nails, salt, and a bolt of cloth to patch the roof of his cabin before the rains came. But what he saw made him stop mid-step. A boy, no older than 9, skinny as a whip, barefoot, shoulders shaking from either fear or cold, and the sack they hadn't even taken it off his head. The trader, a wiry man with a grin that didn't touch his eyes, caught Jed looking. "You need help," Mr. A called out, too cheerful for the scene. "Got some mighty fine tools in the back." Jed stepped closer. "What's the boy for?" One of the other men, a local rancher Jed recognized, name of Barlow, shrugged. "Throwaway. Stowed away in the hay wagon outside town. Don't speak. Don't fight. Ain't mine. Ain't anyone's. We figured we'd hand him off to the marshal or sell him to whoever needs an extra pair of hands." Jed looked back at the boy. Even with the sack over his head, he could feel something familiar. Not in the face, he hadn't even seen that yet, but in the way the kid was trembling, not fighting, not crying, just waiting, like he'd already decided nothing good ever came his way. Barlow added with a smirk, "We'll take $1 for him. You can call it a joke or a mercy, depending on how you see it." Jed didn't laugh. He reached slowly into his coat, pulled out a single silver dollar he'd kept since his father died. It was worn thin and warm from years of being touched in quiet moments, but his hand didn't hesitate. He placed it in Barlow's palm and stepped toward the boy. No one said a word when Jed knelt and untied the rope. The sack came off slow. What he saw underneath stopped his breath like winter air. The boy had copper blonde hair matted to his forehead, eyes the color of a faded sky, and a jawline sharp like it belonged to someone Jed once knew. "Hey," Jed said, voice low. "You hurt?" The boy stared at him like he didn't understand. English, or maybe didn't trust his ears. Jed reached into his saddlebag, pulled out a canteen, and handed it over. The boy drank too fast, coughing after the first gulp. Jed looked up at the men still standing there. "I'll take him now." Barlow gave a half-hearted nod and turned away, already counting the coin again, like it was worth more than the child. Jed swung the boy up onto his horse and climbed behind him. They rode in silence, except for the wind and the creak of leather. The storm followed them for a while, but by the time they reached Yet's cabin in the hills, the sky had cleared just enough to see the stars. That night, by firelight, Jed made the boy a bed by the stove and warmed up beans from the tin. Still no name, no words, just quiet glances and the occasional flinch if Jed moved too fast. But something strange happened when Jed reached up to scratch his neck. The boy's eyes locked on Yet's wrist, on a faded scar that ran across it like a pale thread. The boy stared at it like it meant something, then curled up, tighter, and closed his eyes. Jed didn't sleep much that night. He sat by the fire, watching the boy breathe, and wondering why a kid who couldn't speak would look at his wrist like that, and why. Deep in his gut, Jed felt like this wasn't the first time they'd crossed paths, not even close. What would you do if you saw a child like that left behind in a storm? Let me know in the comments. And if this beginning stirred something in you, the story's just starting to unfold. The next morning came quiet, with frost on the windows and a soft breath of smoke curling from the chimney. Jed Rourke stirred his coffee in silence, watching the boy across the room as he sat curled up in the old wool blanket, blinking slowly like he didn't know whether it was safe to exist just yet. He still hadn't said a word. Jed cleared his throat. "Coffee's hot. It ain't sweet, but it's warm. You want some?" The boy didn't answer, but his eyes followed Jed's every move. Not with fear, at least not anymore, but with caution. Like a pup that had been kicked too many times, and still wasn't sure the hand reaching out wouldn't turn on him. Jed poured a little coffee into a tin cup and slid it across the table. Then he pushed a slice of cornbread next to it. "Don't got much, but you'll eat better here than out in the wind." The boy looked at the cornbread, then at Jed, and finally took it. Small bites, like he thought he might have to give it back. Jed sat down across from him and took a sip of his own coffee. The fire crackled low, and the only sounds were the creak of wood and the groan of wind outside. It wasn't until Jed leaned forward and asked gently, "What's your name, son?" that something shifted. The boy's hand paused, mid-bite. His eyes flicked up, met Jed's, then dropped again. And softly, like the sound was too heavy for his throat, he whispered, "Finn." Jed felt something tighten in his chest, though he didn't know why. The name stirred something, but he couldn't place it. Just a name, he told himself. Just a boy. But memory's a strange thing. It doesn't knock when it enters. It just slides in quiet through the cracks. And something about that name felt like it belonged to another life, one Jed had buried. He stood, grabbed his coat. "Come on," he said. "We're gonna get some wood in before the snow hits again. Can't have you freezing your toes off." The boy Finn hesitated, then slowly got up, wrapping the blanket around his shoulders like a shield. Jed handed him an old pair of boots, far too big, but better than bare feet. Out back, the sky was grey and low, the smell of snow hanging thick. Jed chopped, Finn stacked. They didn't speak, but the rhythm of work passed between them like an understanding. Finn never wandered, never asked for more, just did what he was told, quiet as the falling cold dot later that evening. As the wind picked up and the shutters rattled, Jed found himself staring at the boy again, his hair catching the firelight, at the sharp angles of his face, and the way his hands folded together like he'd taught himself to disappear. "Where's your folks, Finn?" Jed asked. The boy stared into the fire. "Gone," he said. One word, soft as a leaf falling in a canyon. Jed nodded slowly. "You got any memory of where you're from?" Finn shook his head. "Just ... dark, and horses, and yelling." Jed swallowed hard. His own past wasn't much brighter. There'd been a woman, once Claire, auburn hair, quick laugh, eyes like the boy's. She'd left in the middle of the night years ago, after one fight too many. Took nothing but a satchel and a letter he never opened. He burned it in the stove before reading it. Too proud, too bitter. Regret don't rot. It just settles into your bones. He shook the thought off. "Well," Jed said, clearing his throat, "you've got a roof now, and food, and someone who don't yell. That count for something." Finn gave the barest nod. That night, after Finn fell asleep by the fire, Jed sat alone with a bottle he hadn't touched in months. He didn't drink it, just held it, remembering the kind of man he used to be, and the kind he still feared he was. He reached into the tin box under the bed, pulled out an old photograph cracked and faded. Claire stood smiling, hand on her belly, taken just weeks before she left. He stared at the image a long time. Then he looked at Finn's sleeping face, and for the first time, the thought crossed his mind like a slow-moving storm cloud. Could he be? Jed's hand trembled as he put the photo back. He didn't know the truth yet, but something had started to shift, not just in the boy, but in him. It had been 3 days since Jed brought the boy home. In that short time, routines settled between them like dust on the windowsill. Mornings meant firewood and feeding the horses. Afternoons were for repairs, mending the fence, patching the roof, fixing the hinge on the barn door that always squealed like a dying mule. Evenings were quiet, beans, coffee, firelight, and silence. And though they barely spoke, there was something steady in the rhythm, something almost right. But that morning, Finn did something Jed didn't expect. Jed was saddling the mule when he turned and saw the boy standing beside the workbench, holding a piece of rawhide and whittling carefully with Yet's old penknife. He'd carved a strip of leather into a small loop and was fitting it around Jed's tin cup like a handle. Jed blinked. "That's your idea?" Finn nodded once. Jed scratched his beard, then laughed, low and warm. He got hands like a proper frontier boy. Finn said nothing, just offered the cup with a hint of pride behind those pale blue eyes. That's when Jed noticed that Finn's sleeve had slipped, revealing a faint scar along the inside of his left wrist. Jagged, healed long ago, but ugly, and in a shape Jed recognized all too well. Because Jed had the same scar, same side, same place. Years ago, when he was 17 and stupid, he and Claire had cut matching lines across their skin and pressed wrists together, promising forever in blood and heat and all the reckless belief of first love. Claire had cried, laughed, kissed him hard. Jed had never forgotten it, though he'd buried it under years of whiskey, storms, and silence. He dropped the cup. It clattered across the floor. Finn flinched. Jed knelt. "Where'd you get that scar, son?" The boy froze, eyes going distant, lips parting like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to speak. Jed kept his voice soft. "It's all right. You can tell me." Finn looked at the floor. "Mama did it. Said it was promise. Said someday, ... I'd understand." Jed's heart stopped cold. Claire. He sat down hard on the bench, trying to breathe. The wind outside howling against the eaves, like it knew something he didn't want to admit. Claire had carved that promise into her boy, into his boy. He looked back at Finn, really looked. The hair, the jaw, the quiet nature, that scar. All this time. Jed rubbed his face hard. "She ever talk about me?" Finn hesitated. "She said, ... You were a storm, loud and sad. But once you were her sky." Jed couldn't speak. He just stared at the fire, letting it crackle, while something inside him cracked too. He'd wasted years chasing bitterness, hating a woman who'd carried his child across God knew how many miles. And now the boy was here, under his roof, holding his cup. He didn't say, "I'm your father." Not yet. Not in that moment. The words felt too big, too heavy. The truth was still too raw, like a wound reopened. But that night, when Finn crawled into the bedroll by the stove and whispered, "Thank you for not leaving me," Jed sat there, long after the fire dimmed, and whispered back, "I didn't know I had something worth staying for." The next day came with snow in the air, light at first, like ash drifting down from an old fire. Jed woke early, as usual, and found the boy already up, sitting by the door with the saddle blanket wrapped around his shoulders, staring out at the grey horizon. "You sleep at all?" Jed asked, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. Finn nodded. Faintly some. Jed handed him a cup. "Storm will thicken by noon. You ever shovel snow off a barn roof?" Finn's eyebrows lifted, unsure if it was a joke. Jed just smiled a little. "Don't worry. I don't put kids on rooftops till they're 10. It was the first time he'd made a joke in days, and to his surprise, the boy gave a small, crooked smile. It was like watching sunlight crack through fog. Jed went out to check the fence before the weather turned, and when he came back, Finn was sitting at the table with something in his lap. At first, Jed thought it was a blanket again, but as he stepped closer, he realized what it was. His old hat, the one he hadn't worn since Claire left, wide-brimmed, dust-stained, leather-dried, and cracked from years in the sun. He'd kept it in a trunk by the hearth, tucked away with a few memories he didn't care to dig through. And now Finn sat holding it, turning it in his hands like it was a piece of history. "You find that in the old chest?" Jed asked, carefully. Finn nodded. "It smells like trees and smoke." Jed gave a quiet laugh. "That's how I used to smell, when I had more time for both." Finn set the hat on his head. It was far too big, slipping over his ears, nearly covering his eyes. He looked ridiculous and perfect. Jed felt something ache deep in his chest. Finn tilted the brim up. "Was this yours?" Jed nodded. "Yeah, got it when I was about your age. Earned it, cleaning out stables for an old trail boss. Thought it made me a man." Finn didn't answer, just kept his fingers lightly on the brim. Jed watched him, heart thudding with a thought he couldn't shake anymore. That boy didn't feel like a stranger. Not anymore. He fit here, somehow fit better than Jed had in a long time. Later that afternoon, snow started to fall heavy. They hunkered inside, the wind whining through the gaps in the shutters. Jed taught Finn how to oil a saddle and sharpen a blade. Quiet work. Work that gave space for thoughts to float up like smoke. As evening settled and the world outside turned white and still, Finn finally spoke. "You ever lose someone, and it made you stop feeling things?" Jed didn't answer right away. He set down the knife, wiped his hands on his pants, and looked at the fire. "I lost someone I didn't think I could lose," he said softly. "And for a long time after, I didn't feel much at all. Just ... noise inside. Like thunder with no lightning." Finn looked at him, eyes wide and soft. "That's how it sounds in me too." Jed swallowed hard. He wanted to reach for the boy, place a hand on his shoulder, but something in him still hesitated, like the old fear of breaking something already cracked. So he just said, "It gets quieter. That noise. If you let someone sit with you through it." Finn nodded again and leaned just a little closer. That night, as Finn drifted off in his bedroll, still wearing the too-big hat, Jed sat beside the fire and opened the trunk fully for the first time in years. Inside were letters he never read, a silver locket, and a small water-damaged drawing stick, figures of a woman. a man and a child, done in a shaky hand. He turned it over. On the back, written in Claire's familiar scrawl, "If you're ever ready to be his father, look for the boy with the scar in your eyes." Jed didn't cry, not exactly, but something inside him gave way. And for the first time in years, it wasn't just pain, it was hope. By the end of the week, the storm had passed, leaving the hills blanketed in white silence. The world looked softer, quieter, like even the land itself was trying to give Jed space to breathe. But peace doesn't last long in places where men remember things too clearly. Jed hitched the mule to the sled and packed it with furs, dried beans, and 2 coils of barbed wire. He needed supplies, and the boy needed boots that fit. Bitter Creek was only a half-day's ride if the snow held steady. Still, he hesitated. "You ready to see town?" he asked. Finn looked up from the stove, where he'd been stirring beans, with a spoon too big for his hand. "Will they know me there?" Jed paused. "Doubt it, but some might know me." That seemed to be enough answer for both of them. The ride down was quiet. Finn rode beside him, wrapped tight in a buffalo coat that dwarfed his frame, hat tilted against the wind. Jed kept glancing at him, still not used to how the boy filled the space beside him, like he belonged, like he always had. Bitter Creek hadn't changed much, just more creaks in the wooden boards and deeper lines in the faces of folks who'd stayed. The general store still leaned left, and the saloon still smelled like stale whiskey and broken promises. Jed tied off the mule and stepped down. Inside, warmth hit them like a wave. Lanterns glowed, the floor creaked beneath worn boots, and the storekeeper, Martha Klein, looked up from behind the counter. "Well, I'll be," she said slowly, narrowing her eyes. "Jed Rourke, thought you'd up and died in the hills." Jed managed a half smile, almost, but the snow missed its shot. Her gaze drifted to the boy. "That yours?" Jed hesitated a beat too long. "He's with me," he said. "Name's Finn." Martha tilted her head. "He looks like someone." Jed didn't reply. They picked out boots, socks, and a tin of molasses cookies that Finn tried to pretend he didn't want. Martha packed it all without a word, but her eyes lingered on the scar on Finn's wrist when he reached for the bag. Outside, Jed caught her watching through the window. Eyes narrowed, mouth tight, like a storm was building. Not in the sky but in the way people talk when they remember too much. They made one last stop outside the post office. Jed hadn't been there in years, but something gnawed at him. He asked the clerk, "You all keep records of letters sent?" The man shrugged. "Some, depends when." Jed gave him a name. "Claire Madden." The man dug through a drawer, pulled out a torn envelope, yellowed with time, no stamp, no address. Just the initials J.R., written in careful script. She had tried. She'd left the letter at the office. He'd just never come looking. Back in the sled, Finn sat quiet beside him, holding the boots on his lap like they might disappear. Jed said softly, "Your mama. She tried to find me. More than once." Finn looked up, brows pinched. "Did you want to be found?" Jed didn't answer right away. The wind picked up, and flakes started falling again. "I don't know," he said. "Back then, I didn't think I deserved to be." Finn thought about that. "Do you think you do now?" Jed looked at him, met those eyes so full of patience, hurt, and something that looked like forgiveness, even if it hadn't been spoken aloud yet. "I think I'm learning how," he said. That night, they returned to the cabin just as the snow began again, thick and slow. Jed lit the lantern and handed Finn the cookies. The boy didn't speak, just leaned against Jed's side as they sat by the fire, splitting crumbs and sharing silence. Outside, the world froze, but inside, something was starting to thaw. Sometimes, returning to town means facing what you left behind. What would you do if a letter waited years for your eyes? Leave your thoughts below. 2 days after their visit to Bitter Creek, word traveled faster than Jed expected. Out in these parts, gossip rode on the wind and settled like dust on windowsills, quiet, persistent, and impossible to shake. By the 3rd morning, someone knocked at his cabin door. Jed opened it slow, hand resting near the latch. Outside stood a tall man in a black coat, broad-shouldered and clean-shaven, though age crept into his jawline. Snowflakes clung to his collar. His name came to Jed like a ghost stepping through the doorway of memory. "Thomas Granger, Claire's older brother." "I heard you were still breathing," Thomas said, eyes scanning the cabin, then settling cold on Finn, who stood in the corner by the stove. Jed stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind him. The wind bit between them like a third man. "You're far from town," Jed said, evenly. "I ain't here for coffee," I figured. They stood in silence for a long while, boots crunching the snow beneath them. Thomas finally spoke. "My sister died 2 winters ago. Fever took her. She made it as far as the edge of Montana with that boy your boy and spent her last weeks trying to write your damn name with shaking hands." Jed felt the wind rip through him harder than before. "I didn't know," he said, voice low. "That's the problem. Jed, you never knew. You were too drunk, too angry, too proud to open a letter or follow her trail." Jed swallowed. "I buried that part of me. The wrong way." Thomas narrowed his eyes. "You think buying him for $1 makes it right?" Jed's jaw tightened. "No, but taking him in, keeping him warm, listening when no one else would, that's me trying, day by day." The door creaked open behind them. Finn peeked out. Thomas looked at him, long and hard. "He don't speak much, does he?" "He speaks enough," Jed said, stepping to block the wind from hitting the boy's face. Thomas didn't answer right away. Then, he pulled something from his coat, an old photograph, worn soft from being carried too long. Claire sat on a porch holding a toddler in her arms, the child's face round and open, eyes the same soft blue that now stared up at Jed each morning. "She never stopped loving you," Thomas said, quieter now, even when she should have. Jed took the photo, fingers trembling, heart thudding like thunder behind old ribs. "I never stopped loving her either." Thomas nodded once. "Then do right by the boy. Teach him something better than what we came from." He turned to leave, boots crunching down the snowy trail, disappearing into the pines without another word. Jed went back inside. Finn was sitting at the table, silent, but his eyes had heard everything. Jed sat beside him. The boy looked up. "Was he angry because of me?" Finn asked. Jed shook his head. "No, son. He was angry because I ran from what I should have faced." Finn thought a moment. Then softly, "You're not running now." Jed placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "No, I'm not." That night, Jed didn't sleep much. He stood at the window long after the fire had burned down, holding the old photograph of Claire and that chubby-faced boy. The past had come knocking, but this time, Jed hadn't slammed the door shut. He turned from the window, looked at Finn curled beneath the quilt, breathing soft and steady. There was no question anymore. That was his son. The snow held for 3 more days. Inside the cabin, life took on a rhythm. Jed showed Finn how to wrap the saddle cinched tighter without pinching the horse's skin. Finn showed Jed how to make a proper knot from rawhide to keep the latch from creaking in the night. They talked more now, short sentences, soft tones, like the words were learning how to live in the air between them. But neither one had said what hung heavy between their hearts. One morning, with the sky a dull steel and the wind sleeping for once, Jed stood in front of the cabin mirror, buttoning his best shirt, the one he hadn't worn since his father's funeral. The sleeves were tight now, the collar scratched, but it would do. Finn looked up from the hearth. "Where are we going?" Jed met his eyes. "To see the judge." Finn's face went pale. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," Jed said, stepping close and kneeling down. "You didn't do a thing wrong, but I need to fix something I should have done years ago." The ride to town was long, not because of distance, but because of everything Jed carried in his chest. Fear, regret, a kind of slow burning hope that he didn't dare speak out loud. At the courthouse, the clerk behind the desk looked up and blinked in surprise. "Jed Rourke, it's been a while." Jed tipped his hat. "I'm here to file a petition." She raised an eyebrow. "For what?" Jed placed both hands on the counter. "I want to adopt a boy. Name's Finn. He's mine by blood, but not on paper." The woman looked at Finn, then back at Jed. "You got proof?" Jed reached into his coat and pulled out the letter Claire had written, the one the postmaster had tucked away all those years. He laid it beside the photograph Thomas Granger had given him. "She's gone now," Jed said, his voice low. "But she left this boy in the world, and I aim to make sure the world knows he belongs to someone." The clerk said nothing for a long time. Then she picked up a pen and slid a sheet of paper across the desk. "Write his name down. Full name. How you want it to appear." Jed looked down at the blank line. Then, slow and steady, he wrote, "Finn Rourke." He paused. "Middle name." Finn looked up, wide-eyed. "Do I get one?" Jed smiled, warm and tired. "Yeah, you do." He thought a moment, then printed in clear, firm letters, "Finn Elias Rourke." He didn't explain the name, but Elias had been his father's name, hard man with a good heart, buried under calluses and silence. It felt right to pass it on now. The clerk stamped the form. "Congratulations, it's official." Finn stared at the paper like it was magic. "Does this mean?" Jed crouched beside him. "Means you're mine. In every way now. Not just because of what's behind us, but because of what's ahead." The boy didn't answer. Just threw his arms around Jed's neck in a hug that hit harder than any words ever could. Jed held on tight, long, like he was finally allowing himself to be forgiven. That evening, they rode home through the snow, the sun setting in gold behind the hills. Finn wore Jet's old hat again, and this time it didn't look so big anymore. That night, Jed placed the adoption paper into a box with the photo of Claire and the letter he'd finally read. He added a fresh slip of paper, too, in handwriting. That was clumsy but steady. "Finn Rourke, my son. Spring tried to come early that year. The snow didn't listen. But one morning the sun rose yellow and wide, melting the ice from the barn door hinges. Birds started singing again. Finn kicked off his boots and ran through puddles like a pup off the leash, whooping into the wind. Jed laughed, leaning on the porch rail, watching the boy be something he never got to be for himself, young and full of air. But that night, the boy came in coughing. Jed thought it was nothing. The cold air, the wet socks, a little fire, some broth, and he'd be fine by morning. WASN single quotes. By dawn, Finn was burning hot, shivering under 3 quilts, eyes glassy and lips cracked. Jed touched his forehead and felt heat rising like a kettle on the boil. "Easy now," he whispered, wetting a cloth and pressing it to the boy's brow. "It's just a fever, son. We'll ride it out together." But by sunset, Finn stopped, answering when Jed spoke. The fear came slow, like the wind sneaking through a crack in the wall at first, just a chill, then a howl that wouldn't stop. Jed hadn't known many prayers in his life, but he found himself mumbling them anyway, old lines from his mother's Bible, words he thought he'd forgotten. By the second night, Jed knew he needed help. The doctor in Bitter Creek was 5 miles out of town, retired, mostly blind. But there was one person Jed hadn't spoken to in years, Sarah Walsh, the midwife, Claire's old friend, the one who once said Jed had too much fire in him to raise anything gentle. He saddled the mule, threw on a coat, and rode through the night with snow coming in sideways and blood pounding in his ears. He reached Sarah's door just after midnight. She opened it slow, lantern in one hand, rifle in the other. "You got a death wish, or just poor timing?" she asked. Jed pulled off his hat. "It's Finn." The fire in her eyes flickered. "Claire's boy, my son," Jed said firmly. She nodded once. "Get back on that mule. I'm right behind you." They rode hard. When they reached the cabin, Finn was soaked in sweat, body trembling. Sarah dropped her coat and went to work like a soldier. Herbs, compresses, whispered instructions. Jed sat by the hearth, helpless. At one point, he whispered, "Don't let him go." Sarah glanced back at him, her voice like flint. "Then you stay awake. If he slips, he needs your voice to follow back." Jed nodded, and didn't sleep a second. He held Finn's hand through the worst of it, told him stories, sang the one lullaby his mother used to hum off-key, soft. Somewhere in that dark stretch of night, he promised something out loud he'd never spoken before. "I ain't leaving you, boy. Not ever again. I'm here. You hear me? I'm here." And in the early hush of dawn, when the fire had burned down to coals and the wind outside had softened to a siphon, blinked once, twice, and rasped, barely audible, "Pup." Jed didn't answer right away. He was crying too hard. By midday, Finn was sipping broth, Sarah snoring in the chair, and Jed sitting beside his son like a man who had survived a war. He looked at the boy's flushed face, the sweat-matted hair, and smiled through tears. "You scared 10 years off my life. You know that." Finn gave a small smile. "You got more left." Jed chuckled. "I might now." By the time the thaw came, Finn was back on his feet, thin but steady, eyes bright. Again, voice a little hoarser, but still carrying that same quiet warmth. And Jed, he was different too. Not that he looked it. He still wore the same coat, still walked with that slow cowboy gait, like every step was part of the land. But folks in Bitter Creek started noticing things. Little things. Jed Rourke started tipping his hat first. He let the preacher's boy borrow his tools. He even showed up one Sunday at the edge of the church steps, not going inside, just standing there while the bells rang, holding Finn's hand like he was trying to remember what forgiveness might sound like. Martha Klein, the storekeeper, watched him help Finn pick out schoolbooks one morning. "Didn't think I'd live to see you in here buying pencils," she said, arching a brow. Jed gave a half smile. "Didn't think I'd live to see myself need empty paid with coins worn, smooth from years of use." Slid them across the counter like he was buying a second chance, one notebook at a time. That afternoon, Sheriff Boone came by the cabin. Gray mustache, leather vest, same badge he'd worn since Jed was just a wild thing on a horse, with too much whiskey and not enough direction. "You got a minute?" the sheriff asked. Jed nodded and stepped outside. Boone eyed the yard, neat, fenced, smoke curling from the chimney. Boots lined up by the door. "A boy's boots. Heard what you did. The papers, taking him in proper." Jed nodded once. "He's mine." Boone crossed his arms. "Funny thing about reputation, Jed. It takes years to ruin it, and just as many to fix it." "I ain't trying to fix nothing," Jed said. "Just trying to be who I should have been." Boone looked at him for a long moment, then grunted. "Well, it's working." Before he left, he turned back and added, "That boy's got your eyes, you know, but he don't got your shadow. Don't put it on him." Jed nodded slow. Won't weeks passed. Finn started going into town, more school lessons at the church hall, playing checkers with the blacksmith's twins, sitting real quiet in the back pew during evening prayers. Once, Jed caught him sketching. The drawing was rough, but it was clear. A cabin, a man, a boy, a horse, and all of them under a sky full of stars. "What's this?" Jed asked. Finn looked up shy. Jed traced the pencil lines with his thumb. "Looks better than it feels sometimes." "Feels better than it used to," Finn whispered. That night, Jed stared at the sketch long after the boy had gone to sleep. He thought about the man he used to be before Claire, after Claire. In the years he thought nothing good could come from his hands again. And now here he was, holding something that came from love, drawn by a hand he'd once thought was a stranger's, not anymore. The next morning, as the sun rose golden over the hills, Finn climbed into the saddle with ease and called out, "Where we going, Pa?" Jed mounted up beside him, reins loose in his hand. "Wherever you want," he said, "long as it's forward." It was nearly summer when it happened. The grass had come back greener than Jed remembered. Wildflowers bloomed along the creek bed, and birds nested in the old cottonwood outside the barn. The air held warmth again, the kind that sank into your bones and made you think maybe, just maybe, the world hadn't given up on you yet. Jed had gone into town to pick up new horseshoes. When he returned, he saw Finn standing by the porch rail, holding something in his hands, a small wooden frame. Jed tied off his horse and stepped closer. Finn turned, eyes shining. "I made this." Inside the frame, behind a sheet of glass, sat the old, crumpled dollar bill, the same one Jed had handed over that cold, broken night when he thought he was buying a boy no one wanted. Jed stared at it, breath caught. "Where'd you find that?" "Bottom of your saddlebag," Finn said. "You kept it all this time?" Jed nodded, didn't know why, just couldn't throw it away. Finn held the frame up higher. "Now I know why. This dollar started everything. It's part of our story." Jed took it gently, fingers trembling. "Dollar didn't buy you," he said softly. "It gave me a reason to stay, to wake up, to try again." Finn smiled. "Then it's worth more than $1. Jed placed the frame on the mantel, right above the hearth. For the first time in years, that cabin felt like a home, not a hiding place, not a prison of old memories, but a place the people chose to stay in together. That evening, they sat on the porch as the sun dipped low. Finn leaned into Jed's shoulder, quiet. After a while, he asked, "You ever think about Mama?" Jed nodded. "Every day you'd think she'd be proud." Jed didn't answer right away. He looked out across the land, golden lights spilling over the hills, cattle moving slow in the distance, birds cutting lines across the sky. Then he said, "I think she'd be proud of you, of who you're becoming, of the boy who didn't give up on a man like me." Finn was quiet for a long time. "Then, I didn't give up, because you didn't." Jed looked down at the boy, his son, and pulled him closer, pressing a hand to the back of his head. There were still things left unsaid, grief that would rise again, days when silence would sit between them. But now, they had the one thing that had been missing all along. Belonging. 3 years later, Jed stood outside the schoolhouse, boots dusty, hair silvered, heart full. Finn, now 13, ran out the front door, holding a blue ribbon in his hand. First prize, spelling bee. The boy who once wore a sack on his head now stood tall, proud, and grinning wide. Jed clapped a hand on his shoulder. "What did I tell you?" Finn smirked. "That I spelled better than you ever did." "That ain't hard," Jed said, laughing. "I spelled horse with a Z once." They walked home side by side. No need for big words. Just the crunch of boots on dirt and the weight of knowing they had found each other. And that was enough. Inside, the framed dollar still hung above the mantel. But now, right beside it, was a photograph. A boy and his father, standing beneath a sky full of promise. Some things cost $1. Some cost everything. But the ones worth keeping, they're paid for in love, in time, and in choosing someone again and again. What part of this story stayed with you? I'd love to hear in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, you know what to do. Stick around. The trail ain't over yet.